Cool. All right, so new document. Don't want to save it. I'm going to go ahead and build my cube 3D object. I need to go into edit mode so I can get it from a 2.5D object to a 3-dimensional object. Alt left right mouse button will allow me to move the mouse, or move the object around. Middle mouse button will that do a whole lot. And then control and right mouse will allow me to zoom. Just left click in general will let me to arc rotate my camera around. Shift F will show my wireframe. Line fill will show basically the geometry. And right now it's not ready editable. I need to go ahead and if I try to painting it, it'll tell me to make this a polymesh 3D, which is this button right here. Make polymesh. Boop. All right. Changes colors for one if you're in the actual wireframe mode. And now I can actually go to initialize down here at the bottom, and I can actually use QQ, which is what we want to work with on this first tool. Now, it is ZBrush, and it has a ton of brushes. The brush we're using for this particular project is ZModeler. All right, neat thing about the brushes is if I hit B, it gives me the brush menu, and if I hit whatever key, B as in boy, I can hit Z, which will bring down anything that has the Z actual name in the brush name. Since I'm using ZModeler, I can click on that and then I'm ready to go. This gives me basically like edit poly tools. There are some things that are awesome, some things that are kind of annoying, but basically the fast way, this is built to move for speed. So if you can kind of get a couple of things going, the more you do it, the more comfortable it'll become. All right, so first and foremost, spacebar will bring me up the actual tools that the ZModeler brings me. QMesh is kind of the coolest tool there is at this point, and we're going to play with that for the most part. But I'm going to show you a couple other things because I got Q, which is what's going to bring up the actual brush. If I hit W, E, or R, I'm going to get the same rotate, scale, and move tools, but they all have the same gizmo, which is kind of what we're used to in 3ds Max. This allows me to move my object, scale my object in all angles that I would be expected to allow me to do. These tools up here are basically like our pivot alignment in 3ds Max. If I hold Alt, that unlocks it. That's the same thing as clicking it. If I hold Alt, it's faster. So I hold Alt, I can orientate how my pivot sits on an object. And it'll get more important here in a little bit. So let's go back. So I just want to bring this up. W is the move tool. Q is the actual brush tool. And if I can use those two together, I can move pretty quickly. If I hit X, I'm going to go ahead and get into symmetry. And then symmetry allows me to hit on the X symmetry. What the alignment is, if I hit Shift P, that's going to bring up my floor, which is basically like your grid in 3ds Max. The key I want you to understand is the world space. So X and Z. Z is the front. Z is facing front direction. So if this is where the barrel of my gun will be pointing towards, that means that X, positive X, is going to be on my right hand side, just as a general orientation and a concept. Does it matter in 3D space? Not really, because we can orientate it as we need to in 3ds Max for skeleton and UVs and things of that nature. But since we're just modeling, I just want to have that kind of concept put to you guys. So I hit Shift P to hide that. Again, that's just the floor. All right, so here, now I'm going to go and just move into the ZX. And this is just like if you're in the border tool in 3ds Max, you just hold Shift and you're cloning it, right? It's just an extrude. And that's on one polygon, all right? If I hit Control W, it turns the entire object a different color. These are the polygroups I was talking about earlier. Polygroups are kind of like sub-objects, but we can designate them how we want to. While I'm in the ZModeler, I can hold Alt and click on the actual polygons and get them to change the polygroup color. Oopsie. And that allows me to choose a different set of polygons. So I can grab them as a single polygon at this point. If I go in here, what I want to do is what kind of action I want to do, what I want to do it to, and then some other actual modifiers to help you kind of define what you want to get into. When we get into things like bridge and crease and insert polygroups, we get a lot more of those tools at hand. But for the most part, you can kind of just think about what you're attacking and what you want it to do. And then these will fall into place as you build your understanding of the tools as you go.
How did you get that menu?
I'm just holding spacebar. Spacebar brings it right on up. Now, I can do the spacebar in single polygroup or facing flat polygroup, and that'll give me the same kind of concept here. because I'm using polygroups, because the two different colors, that's the direction that they're giving me. If I hold, like, because of different polygroups, I can move different things. Hold Control and hit W, it converts the entire object to a single polygroup. I can also go in a polygroup and change them as I want. I can change them by edges, I can change them by normals, I can group visible, group front, which means I can hide things and show things. What's really cool about this is just how quickly you can make things happen. So I'm going to go ahead and undo some of these steps and get it back to here. These bars up here is your undo history, and you can have a ton of them. After a while, you're going to run out of memory. You're going to want to reset it, and there's a couple of ways you can do it. The easiest way to do it is to actually rename, save your tool as a new tool, load another tool, and then load it back up, and it'll reset the entire history. But that's a process we'll get into later. I'm going back down into here. I'm just going to click on this. I can go ahead and move things as I need to. So let's go ahead and start moving that as a polygroup. Let's get my image up. The thing about ZBrush is frustrating, and I have more to learn about it, is that you can put an image plane on here, and there's like 1,000 ways to do it, but it doesn't always keep with your tool. It keeps, and then it's a hard thing. That's why I don't like saving documents and doing things with it. You have to keep rebuilding it, which is why I'm getting used to actually just having this thing float as a single image. Now I can build an image. I can build a subtool and put a plane on here and stick the image on there and hide it, and it'll go with the actual object, and that's probably what I'll show you guys later. Just know that there's 1,000 ways to do something in ZBrush, and it just depends on how you want to do it. What I want to get into is just the quick process of modeling. That's kind of what I want to look at in this particular video. So here's the basic shape. If I just look at it as a big box, I'm going to start off like, if I use this orange as a base, I don't know, probably let's say right here. That's where the thickest part of the gun is, except for right here where the actual, so I'm basically going to use that as the yellow part of my box right here. Can I do that? Nope. Sweet. So what I'm going to do is just kind of get the basic shape. Now that I can do another Q mesh. Now if I go here and click on this, it's going to repeat whatever the last Q mesh I just did. So if I pull that to a certain direction, I can click on that and it'll repeat it on that space. So that's a really good way of actually kind of maintaining awareness of how thick and how things are sized up as you go. So let's get that image back up. I'm going to have this image on the side screen, which is off camera, but I'm going to have it where I can see it. So I'm looking at it and I'm just kind of compare things. With the X modifier on, you can do some interesting things. There's some things you don't want to do. What I can do here, if I hold Alt, and if I just click on Alt and click on these faces, I'm selecting the actual faces, giving a different polygroup color, and that'll allow me to move now. If I can go to the Move tool, I will move the whole object. So what I may want to do is actually go back into QMesh here. I have that polygroup selected. I come in here, I can do a transpose. I don't like the Move tool. Do not like this tool. Use the transpose. That's the same thing as the Move, Scale, and Rotate tool. So with those selected, I just click on the one polygon and I have this object here, and now I can move this as I need to. If I just move it normally, it's just going to move. If I hold Shift, I think it just does something, doesn't do anything special. If I hold Control, now I'm doing an actual extrusion, just like that Shift on the Shift Control, Shift Transform in 3ds Max when you're on the borders. All right, you can create new edges real quick. So that's a real fast way of making things happen. If I turn X off, of course it's not going to mirror, so it makes it, now it's an asymmetrical object, and you can see how it pulled the object with it. So be careful on how you do things. Now the key thing is about this is masking. Masking is the next important factor on this. It's something that was real troublesome for me. Masking is exactly as you would expect it. If it's dark, you're not going to affect it. If it's not, it means it's masked. If it's not masked and it's light, it means you are going to affect it. It's kind of like what you're looking at the sculpting through in that video. Same thing happens on this transpose. Control is the masking tool. All right, I have mask. I'm holding Control and I'm just dragging. See, if I hold Control and just click on it, it's going to mask the entire object, and then I'm just going to invert the mask. What that means is, and this is a habit I want you guys to, this is an exercise you guys can get into with ZBrush. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hold Control and just mask out the entire polygon that I want. If I hold Control and click, just left click, it's going to invert the mask. So now I can move that object. I can hold Shift, it's just going to move it. If I hold Control, it's going to add more polygons to it, and it's going to continue with the masking. hold control, and then click off the object, and it'll unmask everything. Okay, so let me review that idea. Is left mouse button. So if I go in here and I'm going to hold control and I'm going to select the entire polygon. If I don't select the entire polygon, it's not going to be part of the mask. The only thing masked here is the actual top polygons, right, that I'm looking at. So I'm going to hold control and I'm going to just click and space, and it's going to invert my selection. I'm going to hold control and I'm going to do a little extrusion, and that's that little piece. Basically, I'm working on the handle bit here, adding that shape and depth to it. All right, so hold control and I click and I do a click and drag to unmask everything. I'm not using the ZModeler tool in this. I'm just using the transpose tool in a way that's very much like what we use in 3ds Max in the Edit Poly tool. So there is similarities, and I want you to think about those similarities. And I'm still working on a low poly object, which is exactly what I want to do. I don't need to do a high poly object at this point. But if I go in here and I go, now here's the neat thing. This took a while for this to click in my head. I just have to hit Q and I'm back in ZBrush ZModeler, and I can just go here and click on this. Let's undo that. Turn X back on, and I'm selecting these things. Let's say that's going to be the handle. So now I just, oopsie, I can go into Q, ZModeler, hit spacebar, go to Q mesh, pull that out. There's the handle, more or less. I can go here, hold Alt. There's a little bit of the wood grain piece. Now here's one thing I love about the Q modeler. This is what I love about it. Control W, and I'm going to make this a different poly group and extrude this. Watch this, guys. This is what I love about the Q brush. I come in here and it's going to try to convert for me and connect the thing. So it's bridging while I'm extruding at the exact same time. Cannot do this in 3ds Max. This is the Q mesh, which is what I've been using for the most part. If I'm actually in ZModeler, ZModeler brush, and I spacebar, I'm in Q mesh, and I use flat poly group or single polygon, it's going to try to connect those things for me, which is kind of an actual nice handy tool, because what I can do is it's kind of giving me the connection between the wood from here to here, and it's doing it in a way that's very quick, faster than 3ds Max. All right, and that's. Well, if I didn't want to do that, then what I can do, let's go in here and I'll say undo that. What you want to do instead, then, you can do an extrude, and that'll work just like you would expect it to. But there's no connection, meaning, I'll show you why I don't like move, by the way. It's not a lot of control. But notice that extrude, there's a lot, all those polygons are in there, right? That could work just fine now, like where the handle and the actual magazine come together. That would actually be effective, because then I can just space that gap out in between and kind of give myself some room to work with. But I want to actually undo that, and I want to actually Q mesh that just in this particular part. And one of the things also I love about this is, like, this is definitely too thick of a gun. I mean, if you think about, let's see, where's my boop boop? It's the first time I've seen someone actually held the actual gun. Let's see there, but that. So I made a 3D print of it, and if you look at it, look at the actual size of the handle and the grip. It's an itty bitty thing, you know, like it's the size of this controller essentially. That's how thick the handle is. All right. One way you can tell how big the gun's thickness is going to be is you relate it to the actual barrel right here. So if I go down and look at the actual barrel in my image, I want to make that barrel. That barrel width is almost the entire, like that diameter fits almost the entire length of the gun. So there's my base width. Does that make sense? And I'm only visually doing this. I'm not even measuring it. But what I can do now is I want to add that cylinder so I have a reference. That's a good, strong, solid reference to build off of. So let's throw it in here. That's where the subtool is going to get into. And you're going to be using the living crap out of subtools. So get comfortable with these. These are wonderful things. I can append or insert. They basically do the same thing, especially when I only have one object. I'm throwing a cube in there, and it just throws it in here. So I have the layer that I'm working in and the layer that I just created. If I'm working in one layer, it will not affect other layers. And once I put this object into this layer, into the subtool, it's actually taken on the most of the actual qualities that the original object did. So I don't need to actually create don't need to make it a poly mesh. It already is a poly mesh. So be very careful because you'll lose your sub objects and you can't undo it. So what I can do at this point is I'm going to initialize it into a Q cylinder. I'm going to throw it on the X. Actually, let's undo that. Let's do it on the Y. Okay, Z.
Why didn't you add?
Z.
Why did you just add a cylinder?
Why did I, or why?
Why did you add a cube that you're referring to a cylinder? Why didn't you just add a?
An actual cylinder? Oh, because this is just Q mesh. This is a low poly, more organized object. Like the actual polygon organization of this low poly object is way more effective in terms of how I want to model, because I want to approach the modeling similar to what I was doing in 3ds Max. I want you guys to have the same kind of workflow mentality as you go forward. As soon as you get to a certain level of polygons, the way you work in ZBrush becomes more ZBrush based, and that's where the more fun is. But getting comfortable takes some steps, and I want to kind of have that transition. This seems to make the most sense to me. You can't just throw a cylinder and just run with it and it won't make a difference. But I'm using it as a Q mesh, or as a ZModeler mesh or Q mesh, so that I can actually control it a little bit better, and that's the only reason. So I got it in here. Let's go ahead and place it in the right spot. So select the layer. I go to W, which is the transpose tools, and put it right in here. And now it's a real easy thing. Now here's where that's cool. Again, I can actually hold Alt, change the location of the pivot point, and then I can scale it up. And that's similar to what we do in 3ds Max. It's just a little bit faster. Now with that there, without really focusing too much on the placement of it, that gives me an idea of where my object's going to be. So I'm going to go back up to this object, and I have nothing masked. Just test it out. I always kind of draw off the screen, hold Control. All right. So now I want to go ahead and boop. Let's center this. So we put it at home. That's the object home. If I put it in home, it's going to put it in the home. I think the entire object doesn't always seem to work. But if I have a sub-object selected, I click on that particular one, it'll snap the pivot point to that sub-object. All right, like so if I'm in the ZModeler tool and I go to Edge and I want to transpose it, click on that and see how it's off here to where it was last time. I'll click on, hold Alt or unlock it, and then I lock on this and it goes right to that whatever object I was sub-object I was working with. All right, that's why I like that tool. So let's go back here. Let's put it at home. Let's actually turn off the X. This is important. See how when I said go home, it goes kind of the center home. If I hold on to the X, if the X is on there, yeah, so my X is active, my X symmetry. I hold go home. It's going to put it in the center of the half, of the actual left half, not the entire object. So I want to turn X off, which means turn the X symmetry off, right? Now if I do a transpose, it's not going to do both sides, but I allow centering it on the actual object. I can scale this to match the actual width of the cylinder, the diameter of the cylinder, and now it'll get me going. So let's go over that again just to clarify it. I'm in the brush tool. I do not have X symmetry, which is the X key. You can see how it's on right here. If I move this here, let's just play with this real quick, and it's changing the actual width of the object, so the pivot point's going to change. If I go to the transpose tool, is where we had it last time, right in the center of the object. I have the X symmetry on. If I click on this, go to unmask mesh center, that's going to the actual half of the symmetrical half, the half of the symmetrical. It's like going 1/4 of the width, because symmetry's on. It's trying to split the difference between the two different symmetrical sides. It's weird and doesn't make a lot of sense until you start doing it, trust me. But just know that if I turn X symmetry off and then center the pivot point, it goes to the actual center of the object, not the center of the action, which is kind of what's happening. All right, so be careful that you're going to be hitting X a lot. You can symmetry off of anything, just like I think we saw before, but X is the most common one to work off of. So let's go back over here. So now I'm kind of working on this. I've got a cylinder here. It's active. I'm not having live boolean. I'm not worried about that right now. I just want to have this place so I can work with this and kind of get an idea when I'll go forward with it. I'll probably even slam it in here a little bit deeper because it will go wherever. So I'm going to talk about like, so that's where the shells will pop out. All that line's right there. I don't know what that is, but that looks like a gas escape type thing. So those are the things I want to try to keep in mind as I go forward. Basically though, keep in mind that subtools are important, and every time you're in a subtool layer you can ignore another one. These are a lot like the actual layer editors that we're using 3ds Max, except this is a single tool. And from here I can actually keep going and build off of this. So go back to ZModeler, we'll do QMesh, turn X on, there we go, and doop, and I can start getting the actual rest of my shape. The neat thing is, again, I can also use the transpose tool. The masking thing, again, all I have to do is, if I want to, say I want to attack those faces, I'll hold control and mask what I want, invert the mask, and I can center, and then I can hold control and it'll extrude, or I can hold shift and it'll move. And that's how you can move pretty quickly in the software. So give that stuff a shot.